My father didn't speak to me for 9 years. 9 years of silence, of holidays that existed as photographs on his phone, but not as invitations in my inbox. Of birthdays I spent learning which table in my restaurant had the best light, and which of my staff had become the truest kind of family I had ever known. And then, on a gray October Tuesday, my hostess came back to the kitchen with an expression I recognized immediately. The carefully neutral look she wore when something was off, and she didn't want to alarm me. "There are 2 people asking for you," she said. "They say they're family." I wiped my hands on my apron, walked out through the swinging kitchen door, and saw them standing near the host stand looking out at the water. My father in his old navy blazer, my mother gripping a manila envelope with both hands like it might float away. 9 years, they looked older, smaller somehow. My father had always taken up a lot of space in a room, his voice, his opinions, his expectations, all of it louder than the actual square footage. Standing in my restaurant in a city he'd always called too far west to take seriously, he looked like a man who had finally run out of rooms to fill. I was 31 years old, I owned this place. The reservation waitlist was 6 weeks long. "Leah," he said. I said, "Sit down, I'll get you coffee. I want to tell you where the 9 years started because it matters. Not for your sympathy. I've long since stopped needing that. But because the only way to understand what happened that Tuesday is to understand what happened on a February night in Barrie when the temperature was -27, and my father stood in the hallway of our house on Kempenfelt Drive and tore a cheque in half. I was 22, I had just gotten married. Not the wedding my parents had spent 18 months engineering. Not the engagement party they'd put a deposit on at a golf club in Oro Medonte, or the match they'd carefully curated over Sunday dinners with a family from their accountant's social circle. A son who worked in finance in Toronto and whose major personality trait, as far as I could tell, was that he had never once picked up a bill he didn't intend to write off as a business expense. I got married at Barrie City Hall on a Wednesday afternoon in February with 2 witnesses and a civil commissioner. The man I married was named Daniel. He was a Finnish carpenter, he built custom cabinetry and had hands that smelled like sawdust and tung oil. He was the kindest person I had ever known, and my father had once referred to him, at a dinner table where I was sitting 6 feet away, as not someone we'd consider. I didn't tell my parents in advance, I couldn't. I had tried once to explain that I wasn't going to marry someone just because he had the right postal code. My father had responded by pulling out a printed list of what my future security would look like if I made the wrong choice. He'd actually printed it, in a table with projected income columns. So Daniel and I went to City Hall, came home, and I told my parents that evening. My father listened. Then he walked to the kitchen desk, opened the drawer, took out his checkbook, wrote a check for $3,200. The university savings he'd always reminded me he'd set aside, and tore it in half in front of me. He let the pieces fall to the floor of the hallway. He didn't throw them, he just opened his hand and let gravity do it. "That account is closed," he said, "and so is this one." My mother was standing at the kitchen doorway. She had been crying before I even finished speaking, which told me she'd already known on some level that this was coming and had already decided which side she was standing on. She didn't look at me when I picked up my bag. She just turned around and walked back into the kitchen, and I heard the faucet run. I stood on the front step in my winter coat for a moment, breath fogging in the cold, listening to the sound of the door clicking shut behind me. Daniel was waiting in his truck at the end of the driveway. I got in, neither of us spoke for a long time. He turned the heat up to full and reached over and held my hand, and the only thing I thought, sitting in that parking spot outside my childhood home at 11 at night in a Barrie February, was that I was not going to let this be the thing that broke me. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to know you're here with me. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I'd love to know who's part of this community. I want to be honest about what came next, because it wasn't a clean montage of triumph. It was complicated and it hurt and it took longer than I wanted it to. Daniel and I drove to Kelowna, BC. He had a friend who'd offered him work on a new build going up on the west side of the lake, and I had nothing holding me in Barrie except a family that had just locked the door. We drove across Ontario through the Shield, through the flat stretches of Manitoba and Saskatchewan that felt like the country was exhaling, through the mountains. The drive took 4 days. We stayed at a motel in Revelstoke with a cracked window we stuffed with a rolled-up towel. It was the best sleep I'd had in months. In Kelowna, we rented a basement suite on a street that smelled like cherry blossoms for exactly 6 weeks before the landlord decided to sell. We moved twice more in the first year. Daniel worked long hours on the site. I waitressed at a pub downtown and discovered, somewhere between the kitchen and the bar, that I was more interested in what was happening on the cooking side of the past than on mine. The woman who changed everything was named Agnes. She owned a small cafe and guest house on the edge of town, the kind of place that had 12 tables and a weekly changing chalkboard menu and a wait on weekends because people drove 40 minutes from Penticton for her short ribs. I applied to wash dishes and she hired me on the spot. Within a month, she had me prepping. Within 3 months, I was working the line on Sunday mornings. Agnes was in her early 60s, had started her cafe at 42 after her first career hadn't worked out, and cooked like someone who had absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. She had a habit of sitting down across from you with a cup of tea whenever you did something well, as if the good work deserved to be marked with stillness. One night, after I'd stayed late perfecting a hollandaise that kept breaking on me, she sat across from me at the empty prep table and said something I have never forgotten. "You cook like someone trying to earn permission to be here," she said. "Stop that, you're already here. Cook like you know it." I cried. I hadn't cried since the night I left Barrie. Daniel and I were married for 3 years before we figured out, kindly and honestly, that the financial pressure of building 2 lives from scratch had worn something thin between us. We separated the way 2 people separate when they still care about each other but have run out of shared road. Without drama, with sadness, with the handshake that turned into a hug that lasted a little too long. He moved back to Ontario eventually. We still text sometimes. He remarried. I am genuinely glad for him. After Daniel left, I enrolled in the culinary program at Vancouver Community College. I took out a student loan, deferred my credit card payments for a semester, and worked weekend catering shifts to cover rent. Agnes wrote me a reference letter that I've kept in a folder to this day. The program took 2 years. By the end of it, I had a standing job offer from a restaurant in Yaletown and a clear picture of what I actually wanted to do. What I wanted was my own place. It took 4 more years, 2 investors I found through a small business development program, and a lease on a space in Kitsilano that my accountant said was slightly too ambitious. It was. I loved it immediately. We opened Shoreline on a Tuesday in April with a soft launch for 20 covers and a menu I'd written over 6 months of Sunday mornings. Within the first year, we were in Vancouver magazine. Within 3 years, the reservation waitlist was what it was. I should tell you that while I was building all of this, I was also very quietly paying attention to what was happening back in Barrie. Not obsessively. I wasn't tracking my father the way someone with unfinished business tracks a wound. It was more like the way you keep a peripheral eye on weather coming in off the lake, not focused on it, but aware. My grandfather was aging. He had always been the person in my family who told the truth. He called me on my birthday every year without fail, even after everything, and he never once asked me to apologize for anything or explained whose side he was on. He just called. He told me things in those calls, not gossip, just facts delivered in the offhand way of a man who had lived long enough to know that information is not the same thing as drama. He told me his health was getting harder to manage. He told me the cottage on Lake of Bays that he'd had for 40 years, the one where I used to catch perch off the dock every July, was the thing he thought about most. He told me he'd updated his will and that I should know if it ever mattered that my name was in it. My grandfather died in June 2 years ago. He left me 50% of the Muskoka property, the other 50% to my father. The cottage had been assessed the previous year at $940,000. I found out through his estate lawyer, a man named Mr. Kowalski, based in Gravenhurst, who had my grandfather's specific and somewhat touching instruction to notify me directly by registered letter before notifying my father. He said my grandfather had been very clear about the sequencing. I read that letter in my office above the restaurant kitchen, and I sat with it for a long time. Then I called my own lawyer and asked her to walk me through what co-ownership of a property like this actually meant, legally, and what my father's options were if he wanted to sell, and I didn't agree. The answer was not much without my signature. I want to be honest about this too. I felt something shift in me when I understood that. Not vindictiveness, something quieter, the sense that the ground had finally leveled after years of tilting. 3 months after my grandfather's death, my parents drove to Vancouver. They called ahead through a mutual acquaintance, my mother's cousin who lived in Burnaby and who had my contact information. The message was that they wanted to see me, to put the past behind us, to have dinner, to talk. I said yes. I said yes because I already knew what was in the manila envelope. Mr. Kowalski had told me quietly that he'd received an inquiry from my father's solicitor asking about the process for a consent-based sale. My father wanted to sell the cottage and divide the proceeds. He needed my signature on a transfer of consent document to move forward with any buyer. I said yes because I had also by that point received a call from Delia, the paralegal who assists my estate lawyer, who told me something worth knowing. She had been cross-referencing documents my lawyer had requested from the Land Registry, and she'd found a preliminary agreement of purchase and sale for the Muskoka property, dated 6 weeks prior, already signed and submitted, with what appeared to be my signature on the co-owner consent line. I had not signed anything, I had not spoken to any real estate agent, I had not agreed to any sale. My name and my father's neat printed letters had been placed on a legal document I had never seen. I told my lawyer, she made calls. By the time my parents walked into Shoreline on that gray October Tuesday, the property was under a formal legal hold filed with the Ontario Land Registry. The preliminary agreement had been flagged for review, and the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit in Barrie had a file number. I poured my father coffee. I poured my mother coffee. I sat across from them and let the morning go quiet. My father had aged in ways that had nothing to do with time. There was a quality of bluster gone from him. The particular confidence of a man who expects the room to arrange itself around his needs. He'd been a partner in a small accounting firm in Barrie for 20 years. He'd had a presence that he mistook for authority. Sitting in my restaurant, with the water visible through the window behind me, and my staff moving with the easy competence of people who trusted each other, he looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he hadn't fully planned for. My mother was watching me the way she used to watch him, waiting for a signal about what face to wear. "Leah," my father said, and his voice had a warmth in it I recognized as something he'd prepared. "It's been too long. Your mother and I, we've had time to reflect. We want to be in your life again. We want to be a family." He paused. My mother reached across and touched his hand. "Your grandfather's estate," he continued, "has given us an opportunity. We were thinking, a clean break. Sell the property, divide things fairly, and use that as the starting point. A fresh chapter." He slid the envelope across the table. I didn't touch it. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the February hallway, the torn cheque on the floor, my mother at the kitchen doorway, already turned away. I thought about a basement suite in Kelowna with a cracked window, Agnes and her short ribs and the way she'd said, "You're already here." I thought about 4 days driving through the Shield in Daniel's truck, with the heat on full, and the mountains coming up through the windshield, and the particular feeling of moving towards something, even when you weren't sure what it was. I thought about my grandfather calling every birthday, delivering facts like a man who had nothing to prove. "I know what's in the envelope," I said. My father blinked. "I also know what's in the land registry file from 6 weeks ago," I said. "The one with my name on a consent document I never signed, for a preliminary sale agreement I never agreed to." The color moved out of his face the way warmth moves out of a room when a window opens. My mother's hand went still on top of his. "That was a clerical error," he said. His voice was even. He had always been good at even. "The RCMP Financial Crimes Unit in Barrie doesn't use the phrase clerical error," I said, "but they do have a file number. I can give it to you if that's helpful." The cafe had its ambient sounds, the espresso machine, the low conversation from the tables near the window, the sound of someone in the kitchen setting something down too hard and apologizing in the cheerful way that meant nothing was broken. None of it reached our table. We were in a very specific kind of quiet. My father's jaw moved. He looked, for the first time in my memory, like he was genuinely uncertain what to say next. "Leah," my mother said. Her voice was different from his, not prepared, just thin. "Please, we made mistakes, we know that. Your father was wrong, I was wrong. But family doesn't have to end like this." I looked at her. I had loved her my whole life in the complicated way you love someone who keeps choosing someone else's version of things over the truth. I didn't hate her. I hadn't hated her in years. Takes too much upkeep. "Family didn't end anything," I said. "You ended it. In a hallway, on a February night when the temperature was -27, and you turned around and walked back into the kitchen instead of saying a single word." She pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright. "The envelope contains documents for the transfer of my property interest to facilitate a sale I didn't agree to," I said. "I know what's in it because my grandfather's lawyer showed me the version your solicitor submitted 6 weeks ago. The one with the forgery on the consent line." "It was a mistake," my father said again. His voice had gone somewhere brittle. "A mistake is getting a number wrong on a tax filing," I said. "A forged signature on a real property document submitted to a provincial registry is not a mistake. It's document fraud under the criminal code. My lawyer explained the specific section if you'd like it." My father stood up. He was still good at physical authority, the pushback of the chair, the set of the shoulders. "I came here to offer you a fair arrangement," he said, and now there was something in his voice I recognized as the tone he used when he was embarrassed and had decided to redirect it as anger. "I came here to repair a relationship. This is how you respond." "Yes," I said. He looked at my mother. She had stopped watching him for signals. She was looking at the table. "The property is under a legal hold," I said. No transaction can proceed until the forgery investigation is resolved. Mr. Kolsowski will be in touch with your solicitor this week. If you have questions about the process from here, you should speak to a lawyer, not the one who submitted that document. I stood up, I picked up the envelope and held it out to him. I'm not going to sign this, I said. I'm also not going to sell the cottage. My grandfather built that dock himself. He taught me to fish off it. I'm going to keep it. My father took the envelope because there was nothing else to do with it. He looked at me with something that I think was meant to be contempt, but arrived as something much smaller. You've become very cold, he said. I thought about Agnes telling me to stop cooking like I was asking permission. I thought about the moment I signed the lease on this building, alone, in this exact room, with a pen that had run low on ink and a hand that was completely steady. No, I said, I've become very clear. They left. My hostess watched them go through the glass, and then looked back at me with a question she was too tactful to ask out loud. I shook my head slightly and went back to the kitchen, because there was a lunch service in 90 minutes, and my sous chef had a question about the sauce for the duck. The investigation moved the way legal matters move, slowly, with a great deal of paperwork, and then all at once. My father was charged with document fraud and forgery under the Criminal Code of Canada in late January. His solicitor, not the one who had submitted the document, that one had quietly stepped back from the matter, negotiated for a conditional discharge, which was declined. The resulting fine and the conditions attached meant, among other things, the end of any professional designation requiring good standing with a regulatory body. His accounting partnership dissolved before spring. My mother moved to a smaller house in Midland. She sent me a card at Christmas. I read it and I put it on the shelf where I put things I haven't decided about yet. That shelf has other things on it too. A claim ticket from a coat check in Montreal, a small riverstone from a beach in Tofino, the folded paper from a fortune cookie Agnes had taped to the prep table on my last day in Kelowna. I don't throw things away until I know what they mean. I drove out to the Muskoka cottage in May, when the ice was off the lake and the birches were just starting to leaf out. The drive north from Toronto, where I'd flown to connect to a rental car, felt like traveling backward through time in the most specific way, through familiar names on highway signs, past the Canadian Shield rock face that appears through the trees suddenly and decisively, like a statement the land has been practicing for 10,000 years. The cottage needed work. The dock was weathered but intact. The fire pit my grandfather had ringed with flat stones from the lake was exactly as I remembered it. I went down to the dock in the early evening and sat at the end of it, letting my feet hang over the water. In the storage box where my grandfather used to keep his tackle, I found his fishing kit. At the bottom, under the tangled lines, was a lure he'd used the last summer I came up. A small spoon, silver and green, worn where his thumb had pressed it 100 times. He'd caught 3 pike on it in one afternoon and been embarrassingly pleased with himself about it for the rest of the week. I held it in my palm. The water below me was very clear. I had spent 9 years building something. A kitchen, a menu, a staff who trusted each other, a reservation list, a table by the window that caught the best light. I had also spent 9 years carrying something I was only now setting down, not because my father deserved to be forgiven, not because my mother deserved absolution for standing in the kitchen doorway while the cheque fell to the floor, but because I was 31 years old and the thing I had built was real, and it did not require me to keep holding the weight of what they'd done to it in order to be proud of it. The lure was just a lure, the dock was just a dock, the lake was just a lake. But I was going to keep all of it. I put the lure back in the box, carefully, and closed the lid. I watched the light leave the water in stages. Gold, then rose, then the deep silver gray of a Canadian May evening that stretches longer than you expect. A loon called from somewhere across the bay, and then again, closer, and I sat there long enough to hear the answer come back. Agnes always said, the difference between surviving something and getting past it is that surviving is something you do to yourself, and getting past it is something you do for yourself. I hadn't understood that at 22, standing in the cold outside my childhood home, with a bag and a husband and nowhere particular to go. I understood it now. I drove back to Toronto that night, flew home the next morning, and was in my kitchen before the lunch rush. The reservation list for June was already full. I had a new menu section I was working on, something rooted in what grew in this province, in this particular geography of mountain and water and season, food that tasted like it had actually come from somewhere. My staff, who had become the people I cooked for every day even when the dining room was full of strangers, were already prepping when I came through the kitchen door. My sous chef handed me a coffee without being asked, because she knew my flight schedule. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever stood outside a door that just clicked shut behind you, in the cold, holding everything you had left, Please subscribe and share it. You aren't telling it alone. I put my bag down, tied my apron, and got to work. That's what home is. Not the place that decides you're worth keeping. The place you build, from the ground up with your own hands, until it knows your name.